where I was previously at Edelman, they had this thing called the Trust Barometer. They've been doing this for 25 years or 26 years now. And part of that was this really nice chart that showed you the trust in different industries. For a very, very long time, technology was the most trusted industry. And when you think about why are people trusting technology, because technology can actually be quite annoying because, you get constant updates, you have a lot of stuff you do, you've got to chase the technology the whole time, but technology still becomes the most trusted. And when I think about why that is, to me, it comes back to the fact that technology has made our lives better, or we think of that. And so it comes back to me as a user.
Welcome back to Asia AIM, the podcast that shines a light on the people, ideas, and innovation shaping business, marketing, and communications in Japan and across the APAC region. I'm your host, Robert Heldt. Today, we are diving into a topic that I think every marketer, communicator, and business leader needs to reflect on right now. How to truly earn attention in a world overflowing with content, shrinking trust, and AI-generated everything. To explore this, I'm thrilled to welcome someone who has been leading this conversation long before it became a buzzword, Ross Rowbury. Ross is one of Japan's most respected communication leaders with more than 30 years of experience shaping narratives for global companies, managing complex stakeholder environments, and guiding executives on how to communicate with authenticity and purpose. He is currently Senior Managing Director and co-head of Group Corporate Communications at Nomura Holdings, one of Japan's most influential and respected financial institutions, where he oversees brand, reputation, and corporate storytelling across a rapidly changing landscape. Before Nomura, Ross served as President and CEO at Edelman Japan, where he tripled the size of the business and became a familiar voice in the PR and communications world. His earlier leadership roles at Pratt Japan, Gavin Anderson, and several major financial institutions have given him a rare 360-degree perspective on how trust is built and how it can be lost. Ross, I'm so glad to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Robert, for having me, and thank you for that introduction. I should be sending you a check for that very nice introduction. Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. You've truly had a fascinating career path from finance to PR, corporate communications. Looking back, what was it that first pulled you into the world of communications?
The short answer on that is really the word serendipity, I think. I started my career as an equities trader, and put very simplistically, the only things I would ever write were buy and sell on pieces of paper. Through my career, I came to understand a little bit about IR, but to me, honestly, we had a PR agency. It was a line item on my P&L, and I really didn't understand what they did. They would take me out to dinner once every year, and that was about it. It was always a nice conversation over dinner. And then, purely by accident, I left the finance business and was thinking of what to do. And a very good friend of mine and mentor said to me, well, why don't you come and work for us as a PR agency? And I thought, yeah, I haven't got anything else to do. Actually, my wife said, I think it's about time we have a steady income back in the household. And so I went to join a PR agency, which at that time was Gavin Anderson. And I fell in love with it from day one. Mm-hmm. I was truly surprised that there was this type of work and business that I would just fall into so naturally and feel so comfortable in just from day one. So it really was serendipitous. And, I think careers are like that, because of the very, what can I say, complex and difficult nature of the world today. I think it's very natural that young people starting off their careers want to know their career path, and organizations like the one I work for spend a lot of time on career pathing and all sorts of things, which I think is necessary. But For the majority of people that I've met that have had interesting careers, it's usually been changes that have been just serendipitous and it's just happened with very little planning. And I think in my case, that's what it would be.
Yeah, you've had a natural calling to the industry, and I'm glad you stayed. And you do fantastic work in communication. So, and you've worked with global brands to activist investors, C-suite leaders. What's the one big lesson you've learned about how people make decisions and what it really
Ooh.
takes to influence them?
That's a really good question. I think if we knew the answer to that question, we probably all wouldn't have jobs. But I think seriously, I think there's one thing that fascinates me. If I were to do life again with the aim of coming into the same career, I would definitely study neuroscience
Hmm.
and psychology. I think in a direct answer to your question. I think the majority of things that people influence the decisions that people make are essentially emotional
Hmm.
and very rarely what we call rational. I think people like to think they're making rational decisions, but in many cases, it's influenced by the way they will be viewed, by
Hmm.
the issue of how society will view this, whether they're having a good day that day or a bad day that day, and a whole range of things. And I think that is also very dynamic. In other words, it
Hmm.
changes over time and it changes over your own lifespan. So, one of the fascinations and the beauty of the communications industry, whether it be in branding, marketing, or what I do,
Hmm.
public relations and communications, I think part of that beauty and excitement is really trying to figure out that question of what is
Hmm.
going to be the thing that's going to work in influencing decision making in this particular set of circumstances or context,
Hmm.
because as I said, I think it changes. So I really can't give you one thing that I think is important other
Hmm.
than to say that it is, I think, essentially an emotional process. And that's why things like neuroscience and psychology, which I'd never had the opportunity to do at any depth, it just fascinate me.
Yeah, so it's like really understanding, the target audience behavior, what would make them
Yeah.
take, like really spending time to understand emotions and how it's connected
Mm,
with, their decision at that point in time as well, right? Because things change and, people
definitely.
change along with a, change.
Definitely. There was
Um,
there was a I did do a very short course on neuroscience some time ago, and there was a
mhm,
really interesting experiment that they had. They had iPhone users and Samsung users' phones, and they sat them down and they got someone to criticize their phones.
mhm,
Um, and they would examine what areas of the brain were lighting up in order to
mm,
understand the emotional reaction. And for the Samsung users, as you would predict, it was annoyance and
mhm,
anger and the sort of things you would expect. But it was interesting that for the iPhone users, it was much more of a deep emotional. It was almost like that they were had lost someone in their family, and it was a much
mm,
stronger emotional connection. So even when you look at those two brands, and you can see that there is a very very different reaction to the same product, depending on
mhm.
how those different products have been branded and the company thinks about how they would build that emotional connection. So
Yeah,
it's
so it
really
triggers that
fascinating.
attachment.
Yeah.
Yeah, it triggers that real true attachment
Mm,
to your interest in it, I suppose. Yeah,
mm,
and in being in the industry, you've seen change over a long period of time. What
mm.
are the biggest changes you've seen in Japan's communication landscape over the last decade or so?
I think complexity is
Mhm.
certainly one of the key words. I think that Um, diversity is another word I would use. And the third one would definitely have to be disruption. So let me just
Mm,
talk a little bit about each of those. So it's just become so much more complex, right? When
yeah.
when I started out in the PR business, and you wanted to have someone to, your client came to you and said, "Can you sell this phone for me?" And you think,
Hmm.
"Oh, Suzuki-san over at the Nikkei, he loves phones," and so you'd ring
Hmm.
him up and you'd get him to write an article, and people would read the article and they'd go out and buy phones.
Hmm.
And it was very much about instinct rather than
Hmm.
insight. And of course, the issue of the fact that we are just all overwhelmed with information at the moment, and this concept of what I call, and they used to call it my previous firm, Edelman, attentionomics. The scarcest thing that we all have now at the moment is the time to pay attention to anything.
Right.
And given that scarcity of that ability to pay attention, it just changes the dynamic completely, and we'll probably go into that a little bit later in the discussion, I think. But it's just so much more complex than what it was. And the second point was diversity. So when I was in my 20s and we would go on company drinking evenings, I used to have this thing I would do, and I would say to my head of department, the GM, the bucho, I can guess what sort of car you drive. I have a special power. And he'd say, no, you can't do that. And I would say, no, let me try. And I'd say, okay, fine. And I'd go, okay, I'm sensing that you drive a white Toyota Royal Saloon or Super Saloon. And I'm going, wow, how did you guess that? That's amazing. That's right. And in those days, when you became a butcher, a GM, the first thing you do was go out and buy a white Toyota. These days, that same person may drive a Tesla, he may drive an Audi, he may drive a Toyota, he may drive any Bundings. And I think one of the big changes is that while Japan is still a very homogenous society, the background diversity in this society has increased significantly over the past sort of couple of decades. And that creates in itself a greater need for communications because the context is lower. And we talk about Japan being a very high context communications environment, but it is less high context now than what it was before because of that diversity. All through, particularly, you can see a number of examples over particularly the last couple of years where what has worked well for very long, considerable periods in Japan because of a certain context is suddenly not working because that context doesn't relate as well to people. So this increase in what I call background diversity has really changed, I think, very much the communications environment and creates a much greater need for communications. And the third point was about disruption, and that's really about the disruption that's in the platforms and just the explosion that you've seen in the platforms available for communication. It used to be enough to be with the major newspapers or the media groups, and you had a morning edition and an afternoon edition, and life was much easier. And now, of course, you just have this explosion of media channels. You have new technologies coming in. AI obviously is another thing. So that disruption has just been huge over the past couple of decades. So I think it's just a totally different environment in a sense than what it used to be.
Yeah, and yes, so with the explosion of new technologies and platforms, and that creates more content. So now, as you mentioned earlier, there's a lot more content coming out, and so we are forced to kind of consume that content. But as a default, because there's so much content, and sometimes there could be contradictory content, you start to trust a lot less of it, right? So why do you think audiences have become more selective also on what they trust and what kind of content they consume, and maybe also the platforms they consume it from? Sometimes you just find yourself just skimming through content if it's from this channel versus paying more attention if it's from another channel.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
I think just the explosion, the flood of information in itself contributes to that because you don't have the time to actually sit down and absorb things and think about things, the content as we used to. It's very instantaneous these days. So I think it's almost like it's an assault on your senses rather than a sort of an information injection. And I think we all struggle with how we cope with that. And naturally, it means that our ability to have a degree of depth in the way that we might trust that information has been impaired. I think also that we ourselves have become a lot less exposed to different types of information. And so
Yep.
we see in the bubble that we're in, we tend to see repetition of information that we already know or believe, but there's always a little bit of an element that, well, is this really right? And I'm not really seeing anything to challenge this at the moment. And I think that also works into the trust dynamic, even though when we think about it consciously, we may understand that. I think subconsciously we tend to sort of trust that information less. And I think, I really intrigued recently by the concept of consistency in communications. And I think that the COVID experience, and in Japan, a little bit earlier during the 3/11 earthquake experience with the nuclear reactors. So over those periods, when you think about it, we were all absolutely terrified in some period, in some way.
Yep.
And we would have specialists coming out on the media telling us one thing, government would be telling us another thing, people would be saying other things. We didn't really know whether if you put iodine on your body, it would help you with surviving radiation or what we do in COVID. And I think that has resulted in us becoming, as consumers of information, highly sensitized to subtle differences in messaging. And so that consistency is really hard to achieve in messaging. And so what happens is we're constantly in this process of, oh, I saw that and I believe that, but they said something and it's in a slightly different way. So does that mean that there's something else going on here? And we have a greater sense of suspicion there as well. So one is the loss of trust, and the other one is, I think, the increase in just suspicion. And so I think the concept of consistency in communications is really important at the moment too. But it's really quite a big issue, because I think belief and trust in the information we absorb is almost essential to the proper, I guess, functioning of a positive society. And if we start doubting and not trusting information to the same extent, it has real impact on just the way we view the world. And I think we're seeing some of those things begin to come through in the moment. And then we have AI. And I saw a statistic the other day that said, 58% of people trust something less if they think that it has been written by an AI tool. And it's interesting because I think, people who have become AI natives are going to be very sensitized to that. They're going to be able to tell intrinsically whether something's written by AI or whether something's written by a human being. And that will, will further complicate this whole thing.
Yeah, I feel that percentage is probably going to get a lot higher over the years, and then it might drop down because as consumers, but also as users of the technology, we start to then adapt what is the right level. And like you said, we would get a better understanding of what's coming with the help of AI, and do we still trust it or not? And this really leads into something that you often talk about, and what I wanted to cover in today's discussion: this earning attention instead of buying it, right? In your words, what does earning attention really mean? I was really fascinated when we had this conversation before, so I just wanted to have this topic.
Well, as we talked about, I think, one of the big issues now is that we just don't have the time to devote the attention to things that we probably should devote attention to. And so there is a real problem in terms of the deficit of that attention. And so you need to really work hard in order to grab someone's attention and to retain that attention, and then to motivate that attention. And so that is a really quite complex process. And it's a much deeper process than, I think, an ad. And that's why I think, the concept of earned is really gone. We used to talk about earned media, which was what I did as a PR guy. But I think it's actually gone much further than that now. And it's not just about, having something that you get. That earned media is that dynamic of being able to get something placed in the newspaper or on TV. But even then, you may not get the attention unless you've actually done a lot of work in earning that attention. And so I think it is a really compelling concept in terms of the way that we sort of look at marketing and the world that we all live in.
Yeah, that's right. And I totally agree with you. So this whole concept of moving from earned media, getting the media and the journalists to
Mm,
cover you, to actually understanding who the audience of that media and is, what is the message you're feeding the audience, and will they pay attention to it? And when they do, how much time will they pay attention to it?
exactly.
And will they take action? Right? It's about moving the needle and making influencing action.
Yeah.
Right.
It,
So.
it, it, it's quite compelling because it brings together a number of elements of the things we do. So you need to grab people's attention. So you need that creativity. You
Uh-huh.
have to understand that creativity. I think the complexity there is that there is just so many different channels and people absorb things in different ways and have so many varied interests at the moment that
Mm-hmm.
something that is very creatively appealing to you may not be something that's very creative appealing to me. And so you need to have very many different versions of that creativity in order to grab the mass attention. But even once you've grabbed that attention, you've got probably 3 seconds, or
Mm-hmm.
the memory span of a goldfish, I think, is longer these days. But before someone's going to flip on to the next thing, and I find
Mm-hmm.
myself doing it as well. I'm an avid reader, but I find it to be quite. I'm going to use the word burdensome to actually sit down and read a book for 4 hours. I used to be able to do that with no problem on an afternoon in the rainy afternoon. Now, you get distracted and you think, oh, that's an interesting thing. Just let me look on my phone. And so once you grab that attention, how you retain that attention is the
Mm-hmm.
next part. And that brings in the concept of research and understanding of the
Mm-hmm.
motivations of the people that you are trying to reach. And so you have your traditional creativity, but you also have that very strong research element or understanding element of the audience. And then
Mm-hmm.
you need to understand the emotions behind that motivation to actually change behavior that you're trying to do. So it sort of brings together a lot of the things that we've traditionally all looked at from different perspectives
Mm-hmm.
into one framework, which I think is really exciting as well in terms of the people that are doing the work.
Yeah, it's quite complicated and complex for sure, and all the more for B2B brands, right? And
Mm.
in Japan, for B2B brands, especially those with complex or technical offerings, what are some practical ways that they can start earning attention in a meaningful way? What have
Yeah.
you found that works?
I'm intrigued by the fact that where I was previously at Edelman, they had this thing called the trust barometer, and they've been doing this for 25 years or 26 years now. And part of that was this really nice chart that showed you the trust in different industries. And for a very, very long time, um, technology was the most trusted industry, the most trusted
Mm-hmm.
industry. And uh, in some years by a very large margin. And when you think about why are people trusting technology, because technology can actually be quite annoying. You get constant updates, you have a lot
Mm-hmm.
of stuff you do, you've got to chase the technology the whole time, but technology still becomes the most trusted industry. And when I think about why that is, it comes to me, it comes back to the fact that technology has made our lives better, or we think of that. And so it comes back to me as a user, and it comes back to
Mm-hmm.
my experience. And we often talk about user experience, but
Mm-hmm.
I think, for B2B brands, the killer application, if you want to phrase it that way, is really how they can take that complex product that they're talking about, but how they frame it in the benefit
Mm-hmm.
for the user.
Yeah.
And I think that probably the B2B brands is not as experienced at doing that as some of the B2C
Mm-hmm.
brands might be, but I think it's still really, really important. Um, I remember many years ago working on a piece of work, and it was a B2B brand. And they were talking about, Japan being a wonderful opportunity for them. It was a foreign brand, wonderful
Mm-hmm.
opportunity for them, and they had this great technology and everything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to them, one, please, let's cut the message about Japan being a wonderful opportunity, because it's the suggestion that you want to take away from Japan more than you're actually going to give. So what can you give Japan? And
Mm-hmm.
through that process, it came to, well, if people use our technology, then there is this benefit and this benefit. It's going to change their lives that way. And so I said, well, let's
Mm-hmm.
talk about it that way. And so then it sort of came down to, okay, so by use of our product, people are going to be able to do this, and they're going to be able to achieve that. And it became a much more powerful message, I think. And so I would encourage a lot of B2B brands to think really hard about how do they how do they individualize the experience that they're going to actually people are going to achieve, and make it something that is quite relatable to people. We talk a lot about humanizing B2B, but I think it's about
Hmm.
making it more relatable on an individual level, and taking that complexity that often is accompanying B2B
Hmm.
and trying to get it down to that level is something that is um, really quite hard to do. But I think it is an important part of the process.
We touched upon trust, and you've always been a very strong advocate for authenticity.
Mm,
How can companies and leaders, especially, communicate in a way that feels truly genuine, especially here in Japan, where again the market is more conservative? It's so hard to feel authentic, be authentic, right? So, what advice do you give to your team, and also when in your career in the comms
yeah.
industry?
I think there is a sense, and it is probably stronger in Japan, or has been stronger in Japan, that you need to be perfect, right?
Mm,
It needs to be perfect before you can go, and you want to present this perfect image that, and I think people have gone through so many challenges and been, no, I won't say go through. I don't think that the challenges that human beings go through in their lifetime are probably any different or any more challenging than what they were 200, 300 years ago. I think the difference is that we are exposed to more information about a
hmm.
variety of challenges. So you are
Sure.
exposed to not only the challenges you're going through, but the challenges everyone else is going through. You would never see half the stuff you see on TV today, say 50 years ago. It's just part of the information explosion. And so what that means is that people aren't looking for the perfect thing because they know the perfect thing doesn't occur
Mm,
without a lot of challenge. And I think part of this authenticity is really about how you can elaborate the challenges, and articulate the challenges, and the pathway to overcoming those challenges. I think people are much more attached to understanding, wow, this was really hard. Oh, but that's how you did it. Wow, that's really interesting to me. And I think it builds also the attractiveness of the story that you're trying to get. And you'll know from previous conversations that one of my personal bugbears is people talk so much about storytelling, but they're usually
mhm,
focused on the telling, which platform are we
mhm.
going to use, rather than the actual content of the story itself. And
Story. Yeah.
an intrinsic part of story is overcoming that challenge and bringing and the change that that brings about. And so I think that has become more essential to the authenticity story. It's interesting, I used to do a lot of media training, and media training many years ago was all about being perfect, right? It was, this is the way you bridge, and this is the way you do, and okay, you have this particular tick in your eye, so let's be conscious of that, so you don't do it without. Now I understand that there are actually media training courses where they teach you to be imperfect. Because that
To
humanizes a
be
little
more
bit more and
human.
makes it more
Mm,
authentic. I think authenticity is often thought to be quite complex, but it's really just about being human and trying to relate the story or the thing that you're trying to communicate in a way that is going to be believable as a human being. Um,
yeah. I think this ability to be human. Social media presents a really good platform, and I
yeah.
find that in Japan, executives don't use social media as much as
Mm,
probably the Western counterparts. It's such an
mm,
incredibly powerful tool. What would you say to leaders who are hesitant to show up online and have a presence online and communicate with authenticity? Because there you can afford to be yourself and not have to go through too much filters, maybe as that that you would do in a uh, professional setting. Of course, you want to
mm,
maintain professionalism and decorum and all of that.
mm. I don't think that the model for the Japanese CEO is going to be the same model as you would see for a Western CEO. It's just
Hmm.
culturally very, very different. And so, you're never going to see a Japanese CEO. It'd be very rare to see a Japanese CEO on social media in their gardening gigs, sort of doing gardening on the weekend. You might increasingly see that in an internal communication,
Mm-hmm.
But the external communication, I think something like that would be quite challenging. But so I think the first thing that is really important is a lot of, even though social media has been around now for what, 20, 25 years, still a lot of the most senior executives, because they tend to be of a higher age in Japan than perhaps in some other countries, probably don't really have the direct experience. They're in no way natives of social media. And so, first of all, there is that uncertainty about, they hear a lot about social media, but they've actually never experienced it this extent. And so, first of all, I think there's a reassurance element to this, and how you can reassure them. And the way that you can reassure them is really, establishing the parameters and the frameworks for how we're going to do this, and make sure that you do have that protocol, and present that protocol in a language that they understand, and not try and push them too far. I think you have to. People often say that Japan is risk aversive. I don't believe that. I think Japan is uncertainty aversive, and they're different things. But how do you overcome uncertainty? You overcome uncertainty through the experience of success. And
Mm-hmm.
quite often that needs to be one step at a time. But it's important to be able to have those successful experiences in order to remove the element of, and it tends to sort of be on a vector that goes very sharply once you start getting a few of those successes behind you. So it's all about, I think, that reassurance, making sure that you can demonstrate a framework which is going to remove the perceived uncertainty, and then by creating in small steps some successes for them. And it's the same as years ago. You would have executives that didn't want to be seen in the media, and and then you would talk to them, and they'd say, "Okay, I'll do something." And then, of course, they went on the media, and all their friends rang them up and said, "Oh, that was a great article I saw about you." And then, "Oh, gee, really? I'll do another one of those." And so I think it's essentially similar to that. One of the challenges in Japan is, of course, that LinkedIn, although the market share is increasing, it's almost doubled over the past couple of years. It's still a relatively small market share.
That's true.
And while I think personally it is an incredibly good thought leadership and branding platform, that is not necessarily the understanding that a lot of very senior people have. There may be still some legacy understanding of it as a job hopper site. And so, how you actually bring the advantages of LinkedIn to life to them also is, I think, somewhat important.
Sure. Yeah, I like that concept of creating certainty before and success before you can address uncertainty, right? So that's something I think very poignant to our listeners today. And we got to touch about on AI. In July during our panel discussion, we towards the end we talked about AI, and I think we could have done another panel just sitting there and talking about AI, and it's going to happen. But I'm more interested in generative search. This is how people are being found, or brands are being found. So what should companies be thinking about in terms of reputation and discoverability in this new environment? Because these days, consumers, buyers, people are going on to ChatGPT and Gemini and Perplexity to ask for answers, to find solutions, partners, and whatnot, moving away from typical search engine behavior. So how do you ensure your brand reputation, and you're also found, and we're investing a lot in this generative engine optimization. So in terms of communications, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, it's an interesting area. I think we need, obviously, and you hear a lot of conversations now around the hype of around AI, and I think we need to be very objective, and think that that I think Google still is what, 14 billion searches a day, and ChatGPT searches are something like 35 million. So there is still a huge differential there. So I think it is really important that you begin to have the conversation internally about how this is potentially going to change the way you not only communicate, but the way you resource your communication functions. So, we understand that paid really has very little influence now. Who knows what will happen in 5, 10 years' time? But at the moment, it is very much an earned model, and it is very much an authoritative um, um, uh, impact. And so, suddenly I look at what I do and I think, wow, we have this team over here doing all this other stuff on SEO and things like that. But does this mean that in 1 or 2 years' time, I'm going to start needing to move resources and budget to places that are actually more involved in what we traditionally call earned media, more traditional media? Um, and then you face the issue, okay, fine, well, we do that, but we have a relatively, and I think this is true of any companies, we have a relatively narrow universe of that media. So, how big does that universe have to be in order to influence the citations? And so the first step is, one, to start having these conversations internally, try and understand how the model works. And then I think it's really critical that you do an audit, because depending on which tool you're using and depending which industry you are, and even down to the company level, the way that those sources are going to be reflected in the citations is going to be slightly different. I know, for instance, that the percentage of those citations are sourced from earned media in my industry, finance, are very different from what they are in, say, automotive. And so I think now is the time to be doing those sort of audits and understanding what's going on, because in a relatively short amount of time, you're going to have to be making critical decisions about how you are allocating resources and using budget. And if you're not prepared, you're going to be behind the curve. You are going to suffer. Your brand is going to suffer, because it's just. I often think of this as sort of the way that it's like the introduction of the typing pool. And my mother used to work in a typing pool in the days, and it just completely they disappeared. And so it is going to be incredibly impactful in the way we do things. The other point I make, it's really hard for companies to look at that, because when we think about those sort of things, it's quite difficult to come up with a set of compelling management metrics, not marketing metrics, but management metrics that can demonstrate that impact and the potential benefits of moving to a different model. Uh, you can do that very easily when you talk about things like productivity and efficiency and the things that most people focus on when they think about AI. And so the bulk of the conversation is always going to be about that side of things. Whereas in fact, and so I have people coming to me, and I'm sure I've heard others do too, and they sort of say, well, how is AI going to increase the efficiency of the work you do, and what sort of tasks can we move to AI? But I think the conversation is much deeper than that, that you need to be having in terms of marketing. And you shouldn't be asking AI to optimize things for you in terms of writing. You should be thinking about, how do I optimize things to be read more by AI?
That's true.
And so I think it is a really, really different and challenging set of mental gymnastics that we need to go through. And firms like yours, of course, help us do that. Because you've done an incredible amount of work on that thing in that. But I think you're trying to understand how it's actually going to impact your particular business and your particular industry
Yeah.
is the first step.
Yeah. 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 So keeping in this theme of earned attention, and looking ahead 2026 and beyond, what's the one thing B2B brands and leaders should start doing, and the one thing they should stop doing right away if they want to earn attention?
I'm going to go back to my favorite bugbear and say that I think people really need to concentrate more on the story than the telling. So all the things we've talked about in terms of authenticity, in terms of how do we make the more complex process um, of gaining attention and the whole earned attention element, and how we produce content that is going to be better received by AI or better picked up by AI. I think it all comes back to that one concept of how we construct the story. And I'm surprised by the number of people that don't actually understand story and what is a story. And as I said, the focus seems to be very much on the telling, and I think that is going to be a much more important part of what we do, or the understanding of that story is going to be critically important as we go into this new era of jet fuel propelled disruption that AI is going to bring to what we already are seeing. So that would be the first thing, just a concentration on story and less about the perhaps telling.
That's really good advice, Ross. Thank you. To close us out, I've got a quick fire round of questions for you, if that's okay. What's the one PR or media trend that you think is totally overhyped?
Platforms. I think people just have too many conversations about platforms and get so wound up in platforms and spend so much time on that, as I said, the platform, the story should come first, and then the platform will just naturally occur.
Okay. And is there a book, a podcast, or a resource that's shaped how you think about communication or leadership?
I'm an avid reader of anything, and it's my basic philosophy that this is a really dynamic industry that we work in, and the changes are getting faster, and so I wouldn't really say there's one. I just love to absorb information, and I still find myself reading books on sort of the basics of PR, because the basics of PR today are very different from what the basics of PR were when I first started many decades ago. So I would just say there's no one thing. I just encourage people to absorb as much as possible.
And finally, what's the best piece of career advice you've ever received?
When I was in my 20s, for some reason, I ended up at some reception with a lot of very senior Japanese and foreign businessmen. And I was obviously looking rather lonely, I think, in the corner. And this old Japanese guy came up to me and started talking to me. And I found out that he was actually an incredibly senior and well-respected Japanese businessman. And he said to me, so you're just starting off your career in Japan? And I said, yes. And he said, my advice to you is to always remember the 3 Ps. And I said, oh, the 3 Ps. And he said, yes, patience, persistence, and politeness. He said, they will always be by your side. And there are so many times when I've used that, and so many times when I've thought of that, that it is really patience, persistence, and politeness in many cases. So that would be, but I've had so much advice. I've been really, really lucky in that I've had a lot of support and advice from people all through my career. So, but that is one thing that particularly sticks with me.
I'm going to remember that and follow that all the time, the 3 Ps. Patience, persistence, and politeness.
Yeah. Sometimes you just need it. Patience.
That's true. That's true. Yes, that's true. Russ, thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed our conversation, not just the insights, but your reminder to focus on the story rather than the telling. And we do a lot of storytelling, so I'll take this back to my team about focusing on the story. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks very much, Rob. Really enjoyed it too. Thank you.
For everyone listening, I hope this episode gave you a fresh perspective on what it truly means to earn attention, especially here in Japan, where relationships and credibility carry so much weight. Whether you're leading a team, shaping a brand, or simply trying to communicate with more intention, I think there's a lot we can all take away from Ross's experience. Thank you again for tuning in to the Asia AIM podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean a lot if you could follow the show, share it with a colleague, or leave a quick review. It really helps us to bring more thoughtful conversations like this to a global and Japan-focused audience across the region. I'm Robert Heldt, and until next time, take care, stay curious, and I'll be back soon with more conversations on how to win in Asia's dynamic and diverse markets.
Thanks for tuning in to the Asia AIM podcast. If today's conversation sparked new ideas or insight, be sure to subscribe, rate, and share the show. For more resources, tips on doing business in Asia, or to book a meeting with our team, visit asiaimpodcast.com. Stay curious, stay connected, and we'll see you in the next episode of Asia AIM.